The war in Vietnam is certainly one of the more significant events over the past 50 years as it ripped our country apart. Very controversial. And so we'd like to go ahead today and describe what was going on during the war in Vietnam. Oftentimes, when people think of Vietnam, they think of the 1960s, but really our involvement in 1959, in Vietnam, excuse me, is a much longer period of time. We begin our involvement in Vietnam all the way back in the 1950s, and really Vietnam, as far as a conflict, will end in 1975 when our embassy is overthrown and we are completely evacuated from that country. American involvement stretches out really over approximately 20 years. But the story of Vietnam goes back even much farther than that. Vietnam is in Southeast Asia, just to the south of China. And for a good portion of Vietnam's history, it wasn't actually Vietnam. It was kind of almost a colony of China. And so very much influenced by China. And even then, after China influence began to wane, the French come in and becomes a French colony. So again, a long history there. They hadn't had independence really for a good chunk of their history. They lie east of Cambodia and Laos, and the reason why it's significant, the reason why Vietnam is important, is because it's home to the Mekong River Delta. It's one of the most fertile areas in all of Southeast Asia. They can grow 3 crops of rice there a year because of the climate and because of the ample supply of water. And for that reason, Vietnam is very significant. It's the breadbasket of Southeast Asia. Again, as I've already mentioned, it was a Chinese colony and a French colony. And then in World War II, the Vietnamese aided the French and the Chinese in fighting against the Japanese. And in return, they were expecting to get independence. Independence did not come. After the war, the French decided they were going to try to hang on to Vietnam, much in the same way they did after World War I, and the Vietnamese decided to rebel against this. So the early portion of what we would call the Vietnamese Civil War or Vietnamese Revolution is really against the French. And that really ends at a place called Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu was a mountain fortress that the French kind of considered to be impregnable. They thought, there's no way they'll ever take this mountain fortress. Well, the rebels, led by Ho Chi Minh, did. And it was a huge embarrassment, a huge loss for the French. And the French decide in 1954, after Dien Bien Phu, it's over, we're out. If the United States, if you want to do something with these guys, go ahead. But as a country, France is no longer going to go ahead and be involved with Vietnam. And the United States agrees that we will. And in large part because of something called the domino theory. We believe that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would go next. Vietnam was evidence of that. China had fallen to communism, and all of a sudden, now Vietnam is falling to communism. China had fallen to communism, then North Korea had fallen to communism. Russia had fallen to communism, then Eastern Europe and China fell to communism. So all these countries are next to one another. And so we felt like we had to stop it somewhere. The theory of containment, which we've already talked a little bit about in class. So all of these things go into making us, to the United States making a decision that we were going to go ahead and be involved. And so in the early to mid 50s, we go ahead and begin sending over, really it just supplies at first. We don't send over soldiers. So our initial commitment was really just to go ahead and send over maybe military advisors, but we weren't sending over people who were actually doing any shooting or people who were getting shot at for the most part. That changes a lot for several different reasons. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution takes place 1964, is one of the things that really enables us to ramp up our involvement significantly in Vietnam. It's during the Johnson administration, LBJ. And more or less, it gives the president the power to declare war. It tells the president that he has the authority to tell American troops to respond and defend themselves in the case that they're under attack, which sounds great, except that the president can put them in a place where he knows they'll be attacked. That happened with a United States naval vessel, a destroyer, the Maddox. The Maddox was on patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is just off the coast of North Vietnam, and it came under attack by a Vietnamese patrol boat. Till this day, the officers of the Maddox say that a torpedo was fired at their boat, and that they needed to be able to defend their boat and return fire. Some people believe this is controversial, that you can't actually prove it and that it was made up, but till this day, none of the officers on board the Maddox have said anything other than they were fired upon. And so we went ahead and decided, look, if we're going to put our soldiers there, and the Gulf of Tonkin's international waters by our standards, so we were being attacked in a place that we were allowed to be, according to international law, that the president could go ahead and authorize the Maddox to take whatever means necessary. In other words, to shoot back and to sink the boats that were attacking it. In itself, not controversial. Controversial when you take into account, though, that we had soldiers inside Vietnam at the request of the South Vietnamese government, and they were being fired upon as well. And so now could the president tell them you can fire back? And does that widen the conflict? And when we're shooting at them and they're shooting at us and we're in a foreign country and all this other stuff, does that make us involved in the war? Uh, the Tet Offensive, another huge significant event around the Vietnamese War. It's the largest offensive of the war by the North, by the communists. It takes place on January 30th, 1968. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year. And they celebrate the Vietnamese New Year by burying ancestors, having big fancy funerals for ancestors that maybe passed away in the last year that they couldn't afford to bury and give a proper funeral at the time of their death. So it's a huge celebration. There's firecrackers going off all over the place. There's people dancing in the streets with coffins. And what the North Vietnamese did is they went ahead and dressed up their guys as mourners, people who were going through the streets with these coffins. But inside the coffins, they didn't have grandma and grandpa or a dead body. They had guns. And at the appointed time, all throughout South Vietnam, they began to go ahead and attack South Vietnamese and American installations. It was an attack that took place all over South Vietnam. And it's really changes the American public opinion towards the war. Prior to 1968 through 64, 65, 66, 67, and even into 68, the majority of Americans actually supported the war. It was a popular war. After the Tet Offensive, all of a sudden we realized we're not winning. We're not making any progress. In fact, the North is gaining strength. They can attack us anywhere they want in the South. And so this really changes public opinion to more of a negative view of the war in Vietnam. Another thing that really does that is the widening of the conflict. The Vietnamese were supplying the South Vietnamese rebels through the country of Cambodia and Laos through something called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And we could see this on our planes. When our planes would go up, Vietnam's a very thin country. We could look over and we could look into Cambodia and Laos and we could see all of the supplies coming down. And we asked Cambodia, we asked Laos, hey, the North is basically invading your country. Can you please stop this? And they said no. And so what we went ahead and did is we sent Navy SEALs and CIA operatives up the Ho Chi Minh Trail to go ahead and attack those supplies coming in. And this is, again, another widening of the conflict. Now we've invaded other countries. We've bombed other countries. Is this conflict growing? And that was a concern in the United States. The folks who thought it was growing, the folks who thought we were too involved, the folks who thought we shouldn't be over there. Your peace activists were known as doves. These were mostly your young people. If you want, in modern vernacular, they're your hippies. And they had several different arguments. They didn't all agree about why the war was wrong, but most of them agreed the war was wrong for various reasons. Some of them thought war was just immoral, that you shouldn't kill another human being. Some thought war was wasteful, that this was just wasting resources that could be used to help other people here at home. Some people thought it was none of our business. It was almost an isolationist mindset, that this was a civil war and we should stay out of it. So there were lots of reasons why people opposed the Vietnam War. And one of the popular slogans that was bantered about by many of the folks who opposed the war, many of the doves, was "Make love, not war." It was a bumper sticker that they made back in the 1960s. Some folks also protested the war and opposed the war by dodging the draft. The draft, again, was in effect back in the 1960s. You could be drafted into the military. And some people, when they got their draft card, would burn their draft cards. And again, this is a crime. It's federal property. You're not allowed to burn them. Or they would just go ahead and burn the draft cards and then go to Canada to escape the draft. And so it was another form of protest. And another important thing to understand about Vietnam is this is the first war that really takes place in the television era. During World War II, okay, we got news about the war on film, but that took several weeks to process. Not so in Vietnam. You go ahead and have somebody go over there and take the video, and it's showing on TVs a night or two later. So you could literally go to work and then show up the next morning or the next day, turn on the news, and you could see what was going on over in Vietnam. You could see pictures of it. And for the first time, Americans, almost in real time, were seeing pictures of the death and the destruction that was being wrought by American power and that was being delivered to American soldiers. And this was shocking to many people and really affected the attitudes. It was, sometimes Vietnam is referred to as the living room war because people watched it in their living rooms. The hawks then are those on the other side. They're the ones in favor of the war. This is your military establishment. These are the folks who believe the domino theory that, look, communism is on the march and that we have to defend ourselves against communism, an aggressive ideology whose stated goal is to take over the world and spread their ideology. So we end up by the the 1970s, it's obvious we're not winning this thing. We need to get out. So how do we get out? Richard Nixon as president and Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State in 1973 go to Paris. They talk with the North Vietnamese, and they basically say, hey, we're done. We're out. We really don't get anything in exchange. The Vietnamese say, oh, yes, we won't go ahead and attack North Vietnamese. We won't attack the South, but they never honor that. They promised to give our POWs back. It's always been controversial. Did they give all of the POWs back? We still have a lot of folks who are missing and stuff like that, MIA, different things. So that's been a controversy. Basically, what we did is we gave up in 1973, and we decided we would go ahead and withdraw. And 2 years later, that will be the end of the South. Saigon will fall in 1975. We will evacuate our embassy. They will rename it to Ho Chi Minh City, and the evacuation is a complete mess. Literally, people in South Vietnam who had helped us, who were sympathetic to us, trying to get out any way that they could. We were lifting them off the roof of the embassy with helicopters. They got into any boat they could and just tried to get to international waters, and we would pick them up and put them on our aircraft carriers. They were getting off on any airplane that was leaving off the runways there in Saigon and flying to the Philippines. And a lot of those South Vietnamese are in the United States today. They settled a lot of them along the Gulf Coast. The climate and the economy is fairly similar to that of South Vietnam. And so again, a very dramatic event. And a lot of people, the North, when they came down and invaded and took over the South, a lot of folks who disagreed with communism and who fought against them ended up in prison as political prisoners, or ended up being killed in prison and executed for their political beliefs. So a pretty nasty end to the conflict. So who actually participated? What are the names you need to know? In the North, obviously the spiritual leader is Ho Chi Minh, but he does not live to see the end of the war. By the time the war ends in 1975, Ho Chi Minh has passed away. You'll also hear the term Viet Minh. Those refer to your North Vietnamese Army regulars. And then the North's allies in the South Vietnamese communists, were called Viet Cong. Most of the fighting that you hear of in the Vietnamese War that we engaged in were with Viet Cong, the rebels, Charlie, as you'll hear how them referred to. For the South, you have a couple of dictators, a guy by the name of Bo Dai, and then Ngo Dinh Diem, who's a military dictator. These guys were pretty brutal, pretty oppressive. They were not popular in the South, and it was one of the reasons why the South ended up losing the war. Their leadership was suspect. For the United States, there's several different presidents involved: Eisenhower, JFK, LBJ, and then Nixon that gets us out of the war. Eisenhower starts sending over military supplies and maybe some advisors. It is under the administration of Kennedy that we get our very first combat troops that are committed to Vietnam. But it is truly under LBJ that our involvement gets really ramped up, and he sends over lots of combat troops, and we send over all the helicopters and all the airplanes, and we're actually fighting the war. So LBJ is the one who really goes ahead and makes Vietnam into what we think of as Vietnam today, and it's Nixon who gets us out. The American general who was in charge for most of this was a guy by the name of Westmoreland, and he's the guy who kind of guides our military through this conflict.